Hello, my name is Joe Cartwright and welcome to my studio. Today we're going to be painting a simple landscape scene where I show you how to capture the last light of the day. There are a number of techniques I'll be using to create this effect, and I'll be covering each of them as we progress with this painting. I'll begin by drawing in the ground, and that's just going to be a line roughly about there. And that will allow me to position the old farmhouse, which is the focal point of this painting. We have a lot of these in Australia. Quite often have quite a high roof and then a big veranda all the way around. Just very simple shapes like that. I'll throw in a couple of chimneys. And a water tower. While most of this painting is from my imagination, it is based on a location called Glen Davis, which is about 3 hours west of Sydney. And this hill is a bit distinctive, so people who would know the area would see that hill and immediately know where the location was. Some sort of old truck here. I'll keep it in proportion to the house. Just a windscreen on the back of the truck. And I'll put in a couple of cows. Make sure the head of the cow is not too big. That's a very common mistake students make. Put another one here. You don't have to spend a lot of time on these cows. They're very small. And that's a nice little grouping. Okay. That's all the drawing we need to do. So before I start, I'll just lighten some of these pencil marks for the hill because some of these edges are going to be quite soft. As usual, I'll begin by wetting the back of my paper, not the front. just the back. Let's mix some colours. Begin by working out how much of each colour I need and putting that amount of water in my palette. So that'll do for the distant hill, small amount for the sky, and a couple of other washes for the ground. Right, for the hill, I'm going to use some French Ultramarine, some permanent rose. You can use alizarin crimson if you've got that. Any sort of cool red will do. And burnt sienna. So I'm creating a violet that leans to the blue, or a purple that leans to the blue. Just a bit more blue. That'll do. Then for the sky, just some very weak cad orange. It's a yellowish orange. That will do. I'll adjust that with some cobalt blue when I'm actually painting the sky. And then for the ground, I'm going to mix one colour starting with raw umber. Just a small amount of burnt sienna. The burnt sienna in this mix isn't that critical. And then over here, raw umber. And a lot more burnt sienna. And a little bit of French Ultramarine. And that's good enough for making a start in this painting. Now I'll go back and wet the back of this paper once more. So now my paper is sitting nice and flat. It's cool to the touch, which tells me there's plenty of moisture in there, which is handy because it's quite warm in here today. So let's start with the sky. Some of this cad orange. And I'll paint down into the hill, just like that. A little bit more orange. And then I'll get some cobalt blue and put some of that up in the sky. That'll give me a nice gradation. A bit of permanent rose as well. Too much, Joe. Get rid of that. So we're going from the cool, stronger tone blue-grey into the warmer cad orange. The sky is the lightest part of this painting, so it's better to go with a light sky rather than one that's too dark. Okay, that'll do for the sky. Now I'll go into this stronger mix. These pigments can settle, so I just give them a quick swirl. Now, because this is still quite wet, if I go in there now, paint will flow down, but some of it will also flow up. Now I can either wait and try and time it so it doesn't do that, or I go ahead and paint it and then adjust it with some careful lifting later. I'm just going to go in and get started with this, and I can lift some of the edge if I find the edge is too furry. It's easy to fix. I want to keep these big water droplets away from the edge of the paper. This is quite a big shape, so I'm using my size 16 brush for this. I'm going to try and preserve some of these highlights. I'll leave a bit of white paper there. But don't be surprised if I paint through it in a moment of enthusiasm. I do that quite often. Paint around the roof. Meant to paint around the windscreen of the truck, but now that I've painted through it, we'll live with that. I can just lift some of this paint later. Now I want to give these hills a bit more form, so I'll get rid of my big brush, or my size 16 brush, pick up my size 12, and I'm going to add more paint. Mostly I'm adding French Ultramarine and burnt Sienna to this, so not a lot of permanent rose. These hills are covered in trees. Higher up, they have lots of rocks and that as well. I'm going to let the water flow and help me create some interesting effects here. Clear this away. I'm going to pick up some of this paint and add more paint to it. So this is a quick way of thickening the paint up and effectively increasing its tone. Add a little bit of cad orange to it because I'm now going to use this thicker mix to create the trees. Varying their shapes and position. So one of the ways in which I can create this feeling of last light is by making sure that I'm working with a limited palette with very few bright colours, because when you don't have a lot of light in the day, the colours are a lot more muted. And also making sure my edges aren't very distinct, because again, without a lot of light, the edges get quite blurred. Another tree here. Now, some of this paint's bled up more than I would have liked, as I mentioned before. All I need to do is pick up a small brush. I'm using my size 8 brush. Clean it and just lift that out. I don't want that edge to be too sharply defined, but I also don't want it to be too soft either. Good. All right, so that's our hill. Later I'll go in and put in some fence posts and things like that, but we'll leave that like that for now. And I'm now going to move on to painting the foreground. You can see here how this paint is beading at the bottom of the hill. I'm now going to go in and paint the ground, and a lot of that bead will then flow in to the ground colour and automatically darken it. Paint through the cows. Now, depending on how long you wait will determine how much of that paint flows down versus how much of it just sort of sits at that edge that we've created where the paint has been drying. Quick brush strokes, just leaving little highlights. Think of them as areas of glitter on dew. And to add a bit of interest, we'll pick up some thicker paint. Start with this, a bit more burnt sienna, some of this dark paint as well. Just splatter that in the foreground. Have to be careful, you don't want paint flowing up there. Now, if we look at the hill, you can see this area here has lost its shine and it's still a bit shiny down here. So if I was to go in and wanting to define one or two of these edges, I have to make sure that my brush has very little paint in it. So if I go in with a brush like this that's just loaded with paint, as soon as I touch that edge, I'll end up with a big cauliflower. But I want to define this edge a little bit better. So pick up my paint, drag most of the paint out, tap it on the edge of my towel, like that. And now I know I don't have a lot of paint in that brush, so I can't really get into too much trouble. Famous last words. Just hinting at some trees up there. Even though there's a lot of wetness in this palette, this middle bit is, because of the shape of the palette, is a little bit drier, at least until more of that paint flows into it. Don't be scared to leave gaps in between things and let the paint flow into shapes. All these marks are just to vary the foreground. Because the foreground is closer to us, generally we'll have a little bit more detail there. I'm going to add some Scarlet Lake into the foreground and warm it up some more. This area is drying a little bit too fast. using the edge of my tissue to remove that bead that's forming on the bottom of the paper. If you leave it there, what can happen is, as the rest of the paper starts to dry, that bead will create a cauliflower moving back into your painting. Just lifting some of this dark. And I'm hoping some of these marks will also read like long grass in the distance. Before I dry this, I'm going to get a piece of my credit card, or an old credit card, and I'm going to scrape in just a few shapes. It's probably a bit too wet, but it's not that critical. Just hinting at a fence line over there. If you scrape into wet paint, you end up with dark lines. Let's dry that. So I've just dried the surface of this. The paper underneath is still reasonably wet because it hasn't started to lift or cockle. So I'll try to paint this without having to re-wet the back. As we're now painting smaller shapes, I'm going to do most of the rest with my size 8 brush. And for the roof, pick up any reddish brown colour and we can just add some rust to this roof. You're not going to see a lot of detail on this roof because again the light is behind that hill. Just lifting some of this paint to retrieve the windscreen of the car. Then just darken underneath. That's good enough. Going to extend the roof out a bit. These cows will have a little shadow, just a hint of a shadow. It'll connect them to the ground. Because while we're talking about limited light here, there's still light in the sky. So the sky will shine some light down on the cows or other objects, and that's what gives them that hint of a shadow. Pick up some of this cad orange into this blue-grey mixture again. Paint in some hints of other trees. I don't want a lot of detail there, just a few sharper edges. Here, the house will have a bit of a shadow. Just a dark area underneath it will do. Put in a couple of power poles. Pick up my rigger. Just hinting at these power lines. Now this area is a little bit too bare, so some things I can do, just hint at another fence line there. And I'll pick up my brush, take out most of the paint, and then just squish the brush onto a piece of paper. And we can use that to just throw in some grass in the foreground. You don't want too much, you're just using it to break up an area of fairly open looking space. Smaller marks in the distance. Just soften that to create a hint of a shadow. Just throw a few birds in the distance. Clean my brush, squeeze out most of the water. These cows, we're going to lift a highlight from the top and any part of the cow that we think is facing towards the light. And I'm going to lift out hints of a window. I want to add a little bit of extra coldness to this painting. So to do that, I'm going to add some smoke coming out of these chimneys. And I'm going to use some gouache for that, white gouache, but I'm going to let this dry first and then we will add the smoke. I'll just dry it with my hairdryer. Now, I'm going to turn that around so that it's upside down. Get some clean water. And I'm going to wet that area there. And I'll pick up my gouache. Now the gouache will dry quite a bit lighter. I don't want it to look like there's too big a fire going. Then a little bit of detail on the roof. These cows are a little bit too light in tone, so I'm just going to darken them. That's good enough. While I've got the white gouache, I'll just re-establish some of the highlights on these cows. If you've enjoyed this painting, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. And if you're able, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.